Bobby and the two boys were approaching the old farmhouse. He was the most fearless of the three boys, so he walked proudly ahead, Woody behind him, shining his flashlight on the house, which was already showing cracks and peeling paint. Harry was the most cowardly. He tried to keep up with his friends and sometimes looked back fearfully into the darkness. Bobby had already stepped up the stairs, slowly climbing the porch. The steps creaked loudly and it looked like the boys were about to fall through. When they opened the door, in front of them was a dilapidated staircase to the top. To the side of the stairs was an old room, more like a kitchen. The boys went in and threw their bags on the floor. Harry saw old plates on the table that had long since grown moldy and had flies flying around. Since he was very squeamish, he had to try hard not to spill his dinner on the floor. He suggested that the boys go to another room. The next room was more like a living room, and the smell was not pleasant either, so Harry brought up his complaints again. Bobby reminded them that they had come here to see a ghost. How funny it would look if they ended up being scared of the usual mold. Woody decided to insert a comment as well. He pointed out that they didn't have to stay in the house all night. They could just walk around it and go home. Bobby immediately laughed at his friend's weakness. Harry said he was old enough to believe in ghosts. The boys took out their sleeping bags and put them on the floor. Woody followed with an oil lamp. Bobby laughed and asked where he dug it up. The boy said he found it in his grandfather's basement. Then he took out a match and lit it. Once the room became brighter, the fear slowly began to recede. Harry got sandwiches out of his bag and handed them out to his friends to eat before going to bed. Then Bobby suggested that they start telling scary stories. Harry immediately blurted out that it was a bad idea and he refused to participate. Then Bobby said that if the boy is afraid, the boogeyman will come for him. He could feel the fear. Harry asked his friend who boogeyman was. The boys laughed, wondering at his ignorance. Woody said that the legend of boogeyman is the most famous in the neighborhood. Parents always scare kids with it to make them obey. Bobby immediately announced that he'd never been afraid of these stories and it didn't work on him. Woody moved closer to the fire and, against Harry's entreaties, began to tell the story of boogeyman. A long time ago, an ordinary family of farmers lived in this house. But unfortunately for the parents, they had a son. A cursed child, as they called him in the village. Cursed because he had leprosy. His face was badly disfigured with sores. His parents moved around a lot, but their family didn't fit in anywhere. The boy was ridiculed and humiliated. Then the family decided to move to this small village, where they thought it would be quiet and peaceful, but they were wrong. People here turned out to be even more disconnected from the world and civilization. When they saw the boy, they immediately proclaimed him cursed. The settlers often called him the son of Satan and frightened their child with stories about him. If the children did not obey, this boy would come to them and pass on his curse. So the farmer fenced his house with a high fence, and then the family stopped showing up in public altogether. Sometimes early in the morning, while everyone was asleep, they would go shopping in town. But even after that, they were not left alone. There were some brave teenagers who decided to go to the farmhouse and see the famous boogeyman. After that, no one ever saw them again. The parents of the teenagers immediately rioted and called for the execution of their children's killer. The others supported and went to the farmhouse early in the morning, still after dark. By that time the parents had already gone in town and the boy was home alone. The men broke down the fence and started banging on the door, demanding to come out. The boy opened the door to find out what was going on. The crowd immediately picked him up and tied him to a post without explanation and then set him on fire. The next morning the teenagers returned to their homes. As it turned out, they never decided to go to the boogeyman and just went for a walk in the woods. What became of the boy's parents is unknown. After this story, Harry became uncomfortable and the last piece of sandwich was no longer in his throat. And Bobby became less sure of himself, but of course he didn't show it. Woody continued his story. After that, children began to disappear from the village. It was believed that they had been kidnapped by an evil boogeyman spirit who wanted revenge. Many years after these events, there were brave men who decided to go to the house to prove that it was all a fairy tale. Just like you two and me. As night fell, they went to this house and began to explore all its rooms. When they found themselves in the boogeyman's bedroom and it got quite dark, they heard the phrase, "Do you want to see my ugliness?" No one saw them after that. Harry asked Woody to stop. He was frightened enough as it was, but now he was just shaking with fear. Bobby, he could feel the creeps already running up his spine, still decided to speak up. He said that if no one else had seen these children, then how did Woody know exactly what had happened in the house? The narrator hesitated at first, but then answered that one of the boys had come to his parents in a dream and told the truth. Harry didn't argue anymore and almost disappeared into his sleeping bag. Bobby's confidence faded as well, though he pretended to be the bravest, but he could tell that the story had scared him. Woody was satisfied to have scared his friend so much and chuckled quietly. Bobby saw this and decided to support his friend by starting to laugh, thus showing that he wasn't the least bit scared. But suddenly Woody thought he heard someone else laughing, which didn't sound human. He asked if the others had heard it. Bobby smilingly replied that he wouldn't be able to scare them. Woody thought for a second and then decided to pretend that he really was joking so as not to show his consternation. Suddenly Bobby stood up and suggested that everyone play hide and seek in the house. Harry immediately imagined how they would have to separate in this creepy house and a chill ran down his skin. He said he would stay here by the fire, hoping that the boys wouldn't play without him. But then Woody laughed and supported the idea. He said he was even willing to act as leader himself. After that, Woody walked over to the wall, turned away, and began to count. After a while the footsteps fell silent and there was complete silence. He stopped feeling confident. At about the count of 20, he turned around, expecting to see a frightened Harry and his courage would return to him. But to his surprise, Harry wasn't there, and the lamp was no longer on. Then he shouted that he was going to seek and headed down the hallway. At first he just walked slowly down the hallway, looking around. But then he saw a closed door at his side. He pushed it, but it wouldn't budge. Then he moved on. When there was nothing more to see on the first floor, he slowly ascended the creaky and old stairs to the second. Who knows what frightened him more, the grave silence or the possibility of falling through. As he reached the top, he heard a light knocking in one of the rooms at the end of the corridor. The boy exhaled, a little calmer as he realized that one of his friends was here somewhere. Opening the door, Woody saw an old and dusty bed against the wall. He slowly walked over to the closet, trying not to squeak, which was very difficult, and opened it sharply. But it didn't scare anyone, as the closet was empty. Behind him the boy suddenly heard the creaking of a bed. Expecting it to be Bobby's idea of a joke, he immediately turned around, but he saw a dark shadow on the bed. It was hard to make out the figure, and the man was sitting in an unnatural posture, as if all his bones were broken. When Woody pointed the flashlight at him, the creature suddenly climbed off the bed and quickly crawled out into the hallway. The door slammed shut, and the boy himself stood at the closet as if he were standing still. His heart was beating frantically in his chest. He immediately thought of his friends and realized that they were still hiding somewhere. In spite of his pride and reputation, he decided he would find the boys and tell them it was time to get out of here. When he went to the door and pulled the handle, It wouldn't open. The boy continued trying to get out until he heard a grinding sound behind the wall, and then the sound of someone crawling across the floor toward him. He was afraid to turn around and started pulling the knob even harder. When the sound came dangerously close to him, the door miraculously swung open and Woody ran out into the hallway. Then he turned and shined his flashlight into the room. Then he shined the flashlight around to make sure no one was around. Woody shouted loudly that the game was over and it was time for them to leave, but all he heard in response was a dead silence. But then he heard the same sound, as if something was crawling on the floor. It came from the room where the boy ran out of. And then he heard the words,
"Want to see my ugly?"
At first Woody froze, listening to the silence, but then he shouted that the boys had succeeded in scaring him. He admits it, and now it's time to leave. The voice presumably came from below, and could have been Bobby's. As he approached the stairs he heard the phrase again. Now he was sure the sound was coming from below. Most likely the boys had locked themselves in that room whose door he could not open. As he descended he heard the creaking of the stairs, which now seemed unbearably loud, and it frightened him. Downstairs, Woody saw the front door and it occurred to him to drop everything and run away. But then he would surely be considered a coward and the whole village would laugh at him. Then he heard that scary phrase again.
"Want to see my ugliness?"
It was coming from behind a closed door. Now Woody was sure it was Bobby's voice. He gathered all his courage into a fist and went to the door. As he approached it he began to say that he would kill the boys as soon as he opened that door. Fully prepared to see Harry and Bobby's laughing faces, Woody pushed the door. Now it opened unobstructed. In the light of the lantern, he saw his two friends sitting at the table. His friends sat unmoving, their faces disfigured, and both had no eyes or ears. A scream stuck in Woody's throat. He stepped back, about to run away, but suddenly he heard a very quiet and hoarse breathing behind him.
"Want to see my ugliness?"